everyone, Melanie St. James here, videoing in from Harare, Zimbabwe on Pulse of the Movement. Today we are exploring human security, the rise and fall of peace. As many of you have been hearing, we have a big terror threat and there's a wall being built. We are protesting, some of us, the creation of a Muslim registry in the United States. And as I've been having debates about this with family members and just everyday people that I meet, there's been a real question of, why aren't more Muslim Americans coming out and talking about this? And I just have seen a lot of misconceptions in the media, and personally through my own travels and living with Muslim families in Africa and throughout school, and I just see there's a lot of bridges that need to be built. And so this episode was inspired from that desire, and I'm learning a lot. So here we are with our first guest, Leena Barakat, an incredibly inspiring young woman who Empowerment Works first met in her role with a fiscally sponsored project called Visualizing Impact, with headquarters in Beirut, Lebanon, in Canada, and in the United States through Empowerment Works. Leena is now working with the Tides Foundation in San Francisco and is the Strategic Partnerships Advisor. She has an incredible history as a project management leader, working with the Holt Prize, Berkeley, and other clients. And now, Leena, I am so honored to have you share your perspective with your human rights background and your lifelong dedication to social change. As a mother and with your background as a Palestinian born in Southern California and raised here in the US, what is your definition of human security?
Thank you, Melanie. I think it's good to see you again. So that's a great question. I guess there are two ways you can look at human security, or two sort of widely accepted notions of it. You have the human-centric approach, and you have the state-centric approach. And with the human-centric approach, it really puts the people and their safety, dignity, civil liberties ahead of anything else. You have the state-centric approach, where many people sort of believe that it's state and national security. Preserving that first is a way to get to, individual human security. I fall more with the human-centric approach in the sense that, many studies have shown and political scientists have found that, preserving state security alone, we're seeing this, currently as we speak, is not sufficient to achieving that. So that's really what it is. And then I guess at a more basic level, it's that sense of psychological safety, so that mental security, ideally economic and political stability, all of these factors really, cultivate a full and holistic version of human security. So preserving those rights and those liberties.
Great. And more personally, as a mom with a beautiful 3-year-old daughter, Maya, what are you seeing for her and creating a more secure world?
It's scary. And I really never thought I would say that, Melanie. I really never thought I would say that. I wore the headscarf, the hijab, by choice from the time I was 16 and until recently. So almost about 11 years. And it was some of the proudest moments of my life, because I felt like, as a born and raised American, I felt very secure in my identity as an American, and equally secure in my identity as a Muslim and a Palestinian. And I felt, the hijab was one way for me to present both. Of course, not everyone sees it that way. I was in many ways later in my life was othered by that. I had many people in the beginning, when before things became as bad as they are now, would hear comments like, your English is so good. Where did you learn to speak? When did you come to this country? And I'm like, I was born in Los Angeles. What do you mean? You know, I never saw myself as being any different. I went to the same concerts as everyone else. I, you know, was into the same sort of music, read the same books. I mean, it was very, very normal for me to be very confident, secure in my, in those two identities. But other people did not see it that way, maybe because of their lack of exposure or, you know, their own sort of biases. And, you know, as things, you know, being in a post 9/11 world, my hijab quickly went from, you know, sort of faith, you know, charged in my own convictions about faith, to being more of a, what's the word? A political stance. It was my way of challenging the stereotypes and challenging the biases and kind of putting it in people's faces, because then the comments went to, you know, wow, you are really smart for, you know, a Muslim woman, or, you know, you can play tennis with that on, and these assumptions that I can't be a happy, free-spirited, active, you know, person, you know, it's, to me, was just, I was very proud in challenging that. And then, you know, something happened, you know, around the latest election cycle, and it just got ugly. And, you know, I was, you know, personally attacked twice. And I felt, you know, I have a very sort of strong, I have a strong personality, and I, you know, was able to, I withstood it without really being too shaken up by it. But I couldn't help but also feel like, you know, my daughter was with me during one of them. She was 6 months old, and she was in a cart. I had her in her car seat. I was at the grocery store, and the car seat was on the cart. A woman came from behind me, and she pushed me while I was pushing the cart, and I was in the parking lot. And the cart with Maya in it went flying in the parking lot where cars are driving in and out, and I fell. You know, and luckily someone else was able to, you know, catch the cart and help me get up and, you know, put her in her place, secured. I mean, it was all handled well, but I just, you know, it dawned on me that this is very different than what it used to be. And so, you know, while I was very lucky and very fortunate to grow up in a very open-minded, sort of liberal community and environment in Southern California, it's really not the same everywhere else. And so I think, you know, it's difficult. I mean, in the same community that we've, you know, my mother, you know, she still wears the headscarf, and she's been in the States since she was 16, 17 years old. She doesn't have an accent or anything at all. She's the typical soccer mom. She, you know, now walks into Target and, you know, is the dirty stares, the harassment, that it just ensues. And so, you know, it's, again, it is scary times. It is very different times. And the best you can do is be the best version of yourself, and, you know, be sort of very knowledgeable, comfortable, and secure in who you are in both identities, and hopefully, you know, use education as a sort of a tool to inform and empower others to understand, you know, the world the way you see it as much as you can.
So before I go on to more general threats to human security, and thank you so much for sharing about the different types of human security, state and personal. I think that's a really important lens. So Leena, I'm hearing there's a lot of new threats to you, your family. Clearly, we've heard of hundreds of new attacks in schools against Muslim children, against immigrants. This is happening. There is a phobia. It's real. And from your perspective, where do you see this is coming from?
That's a really good question. And on the point about, you know, the attacks that are happening, I think this is something that is more and more the hate crimes that are happening against Muslim Americans and other minority groups. You know, I want to be clear that, I mean, what's the attacks that have happened on, you know, my community and specifically my family, I don't want to, it's not, very fortunate that it has not been, you know, frequent, prevalent or even something that's been ongoing. They've been, I think one-off instances, which is a result of just the political climate and people's lack of, people's ignorance and their, lack of empathy and really understanding for what's going on. To answer your question about where is it coming from, I want to, it's not a, my answer is it's media and it's personal biases, or the bubbles that the filter bubbles we've created. So I think the media has done a profound job, as it always has, really, in influencing the minds and the masses of the people. Where they get their sources and how they create narratives. Oftentimes is really the only sort of information outlet for people, and this is where they get their information, and this is where fear mongering comes from. And then they surround themselves, we all surround ourselves, including you and I, Melanie, I'm sure, with our filter bubbles, right? Our friends and those who are very aligned with our values, and who we see. We often want to surround ourselves with people that we just fundamentally agree with. It's only natural, but those are with these bubbles, we reinforce those biases. Sometimes it's for the better, quite frankly, and other times it's not. Other times it's, one bad piece of information that was shared by a trusted source, as Obama actually very eloquently said in his farewell address. Whether that's true or not, you're more likely to accept it because it came from a source that you agree with, trust, or value. So I think that's a huge problem. And I think that is a huge threat to human security in one way. And I know that sounds like it's a stretch, but in reality, many people's, the fear mongering that's happened and their convictions against, Muslims and their ideas of radical Islam and this crazy notion that, we're out to spread Sharia everywhere, is really sort of rooted in many ways baseless and factless information. So it's their sort of own biases that reinforce their sort of theory of change, and it's really unfortunate that it's really at the expense of their peers, fellow Americans, Muslim Americans, and it's nothing new. I mean, this is, I think, groups have been targeted since the beginning of time to sort of fit an agenda, really. I think that, it's in many, like the Japanese, they were targeted at one point, and they were, you had many groups that, and to justify the entry into a war, or to justify the passage of a very politically charged bill that otherwise would not have gained support. They say that, you learn in school, political science classes, that the easiest way for the state or governments to really get what they want and get the people behind them, I mean, look at Vietnam, look at Iraq, is to have a common enemy, and they have to create the narrative around that. So, the way I look at, what's going on today, and really with anything, is I always ask, who's benefiting? Who's benefiting from what's happening? In the last of this, we can start with 9/11, and to this day, how many years has it been? I mean, have the Muslims or Islam, has it benefited once from anything that's happened? When you look at, recently what's going on with ISIS, I mean, the most victims in the ISIS attacks are Muslims themselves. And people often overlook that and don't see that. I mean, this is why we can get into it at a later time. I mean, you see this sort of refugee crisis that's happening, but Muslims have not benefited one bit from anything that's going on, from these sort of one-off, attacks that's happened, or domestically or internationally. But the facts are, when you look at it, you're more likely to get attacked or killed by a cow, literally, look this up, than you are by being impacted by a terrorist attack. It's just, it's this whole thing has been completely overblown, and I think it's the media and the government is trying to shape a narrative, and today it's us, tomorrow it'll be someone else, and the day before it was someone else. So it's horrible. I just wish we were in a place where we would have learned from history and understand what's going on here, and really sort of banded on, to sort of stand up for one another a little bit more. But social media has done a really great job in, sharing information, and we do live in the information age. And I think with that and the power of social media, I think we're seeing a lot of improvement and a lot more solidarity.
So Leena, absolutely. You mentioned we have more of a likelihood of being killed by a cow on the road. I actually read a similar figure. I think being hitting a deer or something in a car accident, or drowning in your own bathtub, there's a much higher likelihood than a terrorist attack. And also understanding that 40% of actual terrorist attacks have nothing to do with radical Islam. They're because of mental illness, which is a huge issue in this country. And so looking at your work with Tides and all of the incredible solutions that you're involved in, what are the greater threats to human security and some of the solutions? But really, what should we be working on to create a more secure future for everyone?
I don't think we're doing a great job of, there's a lot of solidarity. And I think there's a lot of people, on this sort of scale, there's, generally we agree on what the issues are, in the field, that is, and especially among activists who are really trying to, create change and improve the lives of those who, especially the most vulnerable, who are affected. However, I don't think we've done a necessarily great job at unifying certain principles, strategies, and tactics together. I think the right has done particularly well at this. I mean, while, the most sort of basic level, when the minute Obama was elected into presidency, they began organizing immediately to basically change the entire face of office. And now look what we see. It's red at every level, at every step of the way. They organized swiftly. And I think there's a little bit, there's good things about being decentralized, and there's things that are not so great about it. And I think so, back to the issue areas, a huge threat to human security, off the top of my head that stands out really is, on a national domestic, it's surveillance. I think that's something that, swept the, our news feeds for a while as something that's happened, especially with, the issues that Edward Snowden really brought to light. I think is a massive threat, because now we're turning, on a domestic level, we're moving closer and closer, if we're not already a big brother state. That is a huge threat to human security. And I think, if we were to really see that human security is an integral part of achieving and maintaining international peace, I think we could all do a better job to protect that. If we start at that as the base level, I think a lot can come into line, and there would, I think it would do away with many of the conflicts and the issues that we have, because at least we unify on that. Whenever I speak about very contentious issues, whether it be Israel-Palestine, whether it be about Syria, whether, any of these sort of issues, and the one thing, or even, with the Black Lives Matter movement, the one common ground I'm always able to connect with those from the other side, those who sort of see very differently than us, is this notion of human security. And that's just something no one can do without. And I think the more we understand that, the more we accept that, the more we use that as a frame, I think the more likely we're going to be able to connect with the other side, and hopefully sort of a better sort of future lies ahead with that.
So when you say the other side, people who think differently than we do, people who might be on another part of the political spectrum?
It is. It's not think differently as if there's the one that's better than the other. I think the people, their ideologies are driven by their own personal circumstances and conditions. When I think about the other side, I'm thinking about the left and the right, the red and the blue, or even the green, as part of that. So it's for me, it's one of the failures in this election cycle is this sort of is our own as Democrats or as the left, and we've become sort of elite in our own way, and this sort of, actually Bernie addressed it as the Democratic elitism, and I think that's spot on. We've written off a lot of those who supported Trump as just being racist and being bigots and uneducated, when that's just simply not true. I mean, a lot of what's happened, you know, that's affected their lives, you know, economically, and their livelihoods really sort of shaped their decisions going, you know, towards Trump. And quite frankly, they were just fed up of the system at large, and they didn't want that repeated. But we did not take the time to have that conversation and to connect with them more. And so I can take that on again, domestic, but even internationally, when I think about all of the bigotry against Muslims, and you know, it's so simple, but talk to a Muslim. Just talk to one. I mean, you know, we're mostly great people. So there's really the fear is it in some ways it cracks me up if it wasn't so serious. You know, I want to laugh about, you know, on what are you so afraid of?
So jumping back into the questions, I do want to mention this issue about the outcry about a Muslim registry in the United States.
Yeah.
And this has been brought up in the media. I know I signed at least one petition. I was really shocked to see some of the comments and people who said they wouldn't sign because they really felt that this was a prudent security measure. And again, from your human rights background and from a civil rights perspective, how do you see this? What's at stake?
Civil liberties are at stake, and honestly, dignity. Like at the very basic, you know, Muslims are being more and more dehumanized as these policies and these proposals come about. I mean, it's absurd to me. It took me really a while to believe it and to let it sink in. I just thought it was one of those just crazy things that was thrown out there by Trump in, you know, the heat of the moment, and, you know, didn't think it was something that would really be taken seriously and perhaps considered. I look to history. I mean, when has that ever worked? You know, did they find informants when they you know, try to, you know, with the Japanese internment camps, there was a form of registry that was created, you know, to be able to track and put the Japanese in internment camps. That didn't work. They didn't find any sort of, you know, at the time the concern were spies. You know, when you look at with the Jewish people, I mean, this is something that this country, as they should be, is so sensitized to. You know, and we use that all the time when we talk about the Holocaust, right? The SARS and the badges that they had to wear. I mean, we're taught in schools, and then without even being taught, you just know that's not right, and nor was it effective, and nor was there any really sort of thought to it, other than to really dehumanize and humiliate a population. And so you know, when the fact that this is even being considered, and, you know, I watched actually a segment on, and they were interviewing one of Trump's campaign affiliates, and the journalist asked, doesn't this concern you that this is really something that you guys want to do? We've seen this before. And he said, well, exactly, no, this has been done before. I don't know why everyone's reacting. We've done this before. This is nothing new. And the interviewer goes, exactly. It was awful. Why would we repeat that? You know, it's been proven completely ineffective and whatnot. And he completely used that as a way to justify. So, I mean, there is a level of just crazy you can't really make, you know, sense of. And part of me is just happy doing, you know, just doing away with that. But at the same time, you know, I think it's been really beautiful to see the level of, you know, solidarity and people coming out and saying, you know, we're not gonna be, you know, we're gonna sign this petition and we're gonna, you know, register ourselves as Muslims. And there's a half of me that's like, but this is crazy to begin with. And the other half of me that's like, well, thank you. So, you know, I just, it's a very scary thing. And then, of course, you know, going back to the question you asked about, you know, like raising my daughter in this sort of day and age, and it terrifies me. I don't know. I constantly have to think, you know, about how am I going to prepare her or to have this conversation with her when that time comes about what's going on. And at this point, it could change at any point, you know, that it's we have to continue to be rooted in who we are and hold on to the American values that were instilled in us. Just the very basic democratic values, and I don't mean Democratic Party, but the very civil liberties and civil rights is something that was created for a reason. And it created in response to situations like this and worse in the past. So I think the closer we hold on to that, the closer we continue to not fall subject to, these fears, to break out of our comfort zones, have conversations with people we wouldn't normally, eliminate as much as we can our biases. That's how I think we're going to improve relations going forward. Because, I can't tell you how many times, Melanie, I've had conversations with just average Joes, just people on, people at the grocery store, or people, at these sort of groups where I wouldn't speak to otherwise, and tell me, you really changed my mind about how I see this, specifically about Muslims, how they view Muslims and Islam. And I think for us Muslims to continue to be very willing to have these conversations and approachable. Some people are not very approachable, and that's of course, that's to each their own. But I think the more we're willing to open ourselves up to having conversations, just being who you are will do a lot to diminish some of the stereotypes that people have in their head.
Thank you, Leena. And to add to that, and that was really powerful, the power we have is the power to connect with people. Just get out of the machine, get beyond the media and be the media. And I love how you are being the media, and you are so compelling and lovable. So thank you for getting out there and representing. Your voice really matters. And what can we say to people out there, anyone watching this? How can we all be the solution? Are there any suggestions, calls to action, things that you would recommend or invite people to do to create a more peaceful, secure world anywhere, wherever we are on the planet?
I think, building off that point of the power to connect, I think is should not be underestimated. Just the power of conversation, the power of, of course, not to sound cheesy, but really education and informing yourself of the issues going on. And, when different sort of narratives are built around certain people's, asking yourself, oh, excuse me, I'm so sorry.
Leena, I really see you being out there as the media, as much as the media may be going wrong. Thank you for that. And it's clear the power we have is the power to connect. And so in doing that, and just all the ways we can reach out, what can you tell people who are watching this today? What are some solutions for all of us to support a more secure, peaceful world wherever we are?
It's a loaded question, Melanie. How do we save the world? Building off the point on the power to connect, that cannot be underestimated enough. Just the ability to have those conversations, to getting out of your comfort zone, as I said earlier. These things are very important because this is how you shape opinions, and person by person. Beyond that, I think it's a lot of people tend to believe that, because they're not some sort of eloquent speaker, refined activist, or some sort of journalist, that they have no role in this, but that's simply not true. I think everyone has a role to play, whether it's the power of conversation or educating yourself and informing yourself on the issues. When narratives are shaped about certain groups, especially right now, ours tends to be the, Muslim Americans front and center, is, asking yourself who benefits and looking a little bit, deeper into that and questioning whether the source you're taking this from, is it just because it's a comfortable source? Have you considered other options? And shaping those sort of opinions for yourself that way. The other thing I would say is, while everyone has a role and everyone will sort of contribute in their own way, getting out of your comfort zone of just be like social media click activism, it's so easy. It's so easy, and you think you're kind of doing your part, and in many ways, it's done a lot. But if there's more that you can do, whether it's showing up to a protest, being more civically engaged, I cannot emphasize the power of the importance of civic engagement. Calling your representatives. I know. I remember briefly, I remember in 2008, 2009, the attacks on the Gaza Strip, I was working with the Muslim Public Affairs Council at the time, and we went to go meet with the mayor of Los Angeles, and to sort of express our concern and his support for Israel. And we wanted to sort of have that conversation with him. And he said, I'm going to be honest with you guys, our phones are ringing off the hook. And the amount of calls we're getting, to continue our support for Israel is, he said it's almost 100 to 1 of the calls I'm getting from those who, want to speak towards the human rights issues in Palestine. He said, we just don't get calls from other communities as much as we do from this community. They're very well organized, and that's something to take. We need to be placing our calls to our elected officials and voice our concerns, as people don't want to go through the hassles or think it's not effective, but it absolutely is. So really, civic engagement, I think, is key.
Thank you so much, Leena. Thank you. It just means the world to have you with us today, and I really look forward to continuing this discussion and getting the word out and having more calls to action. So Absolutely. Thank you for being such a great voice out in the world and shedding light on how Absolutely. To connect all of these perspectives.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Melanie St. James here, back with Empowerment Works Pulse of the Movement. As we continue to explore human security, we may be feeling a little more at home or at peace with our Muslim American neighbors. However, many people in the United States are still very concerned about immigration and possible threats that Muslim or other immigrants might be having on human security in the USA, particularly around terrorist attacks. To help understand some of these issues better, we are absolutely privileged to welcome internationally recognized best-selling author Robert Young Pelton. Robert has a storied career of traveling to the world's most dangerous places and meeting with some of their most dangerous people. Often on both sides of the war issues with different armies, he seems to be the last one standing. His most recent books include License to Kill, Hired Guns in the War on Terror, a book about mercenaries and private contractors, and Raven, a YA story based on his early childhood. He has been a frequent media contributor and is internationally recognized as the guy who can find anyone, anywhere. In recent years, however, he has been working on a different type of dangerous mission, helping those migrants who are at peril as they cross deadly water routes from conflict areas to the relative safety of Europe. Robert, thank you so much for being here with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So Robert, with all of your adventures in dangerous places as an author and a war journalist, what are you working on now?
My background actually was in marketing, and I was paid a lot of money to develop products and understand social change and what people wanted. And around the age of 40, I retired, and I ended up spending my time focusing on conflict. So I went inside most of the dirty wars, so far about, 2 or 3 dozen. And then I was most recently in Sirte, Libya, for example, in the fight against ISIS. And what happens is when you spend a lot of time in warfare, you notice that it affects civilians. And I've chosen certain subjects. So originally I was focused on jihadis and these Islamic fundamentalist wars. I then focused on proxy wars with mercenaries and contractors. And then now I'm focused on essentially displacement. And right now it's probably the biggest single problem that we face and other nations face is how to deal with 65 million people who are no longer in their homes. And these people have a variety of reasons for leaving their homes, but a lot of the impetus is that we've had these wars that have gone on for 15 years and obviously some even longer. which don't have resolutions, which keeps people out of their countries and also forces more and more people out of their countries. But when they leave their countries, they go into another country. So everybody from Europe to America to Latin America is dealing with the influx of people that they didn't invite into their country, and how that affects their culture and their security and their national structure.
What drew you to helping migrants? What is it that took you back out to risk your life in these rescues?
The basic problem is that humans normally migrate either on a daily basis or weekly or monthly basis, but they have stability. And with the rise of the city-state and the borders and the idea that continents now have imaginary lines that you can't cross because it's controlled by another government, we're now getting back to the period of time in which people just moved. They had no reason to obey laws or borders. They simply didn't want to stay in one place, and they went to another place. And of course, Europe was probably the most affected by this. But people have migrated throughout history. So we're getting back to a period where we're suddenly realizing that human beings don't necessarily need permission to move across continents.
And with all of your experience, what are you seeing as some of the biggest issues, challenges, and possible solutions in human migration today?
The biggest single problem is dealing with both the positive and negative effects of migration at the same time. You know, if you look at the United States, we have massive populations of what you would call illegal immigrants or undocumented aliens. And most of these people are integrated into the social system. They work at jobs, they do whatever they do, and they don't necessarily cause problems or upheavals. And then you also have people who come in specifically to commit crimes and use the porous borders to do something here and then go back to a different country. So it's hard to have that duality when you're a politician, because obviously people that already live in a country are going to say, keep those people out, they're going to steal my job, they're going to rob banks, they're going to do whatever. And yet those same people will use those people to cut their grass or to clean their toilets or to fix their wallpaper or their house. So what you see all around the world is that migrants actually flow into economic opportunity, unless they're artificially held in camps. And you see these outside of Somalia, where, for example, Dadaab had a population, I think at its peak, of almost 1 million people, pulling people out of the economy and destroying Somalia. So just to recap, is if we can view migration as a reality, in other words, it's happening whether we want it to happen or not, and that there are both positive and negative effects of that. When you say solutions, the migrants and the organizations that move migrants don't care about solutions. And this is one of the things that I think perplexes Europe and America. I run ground networks in Libya, and I track human smugglers, and I look at the economics involved and how they operate. And you have to remember that they make more money than the border control people do. So the concept of smuggling and going across borders is a much bigger business than the government effort to keep those people out. You hear a lot about building walls. Mm-hmm. And if you go to Palestine or if you go to Mexico, you'll suddenly notice there's these huge tunnels with railroad tracks and lighting and air conditioning. So one of the things that we have to be is very pragmatic about arbitrary decisions that don't necessarily fix anything, that just create another methodology for people and goods to come into a country. Mm. And this is what I see the biggest failing right now is a pragmatic approach as opposed to a simplistic approach. People, particularly white people, like the idea of walls and moats. Mm-hmm. They figure if they build a moat like the Mediterranean or the Atlantic, people won't get across. And if they build a wall, people won't be able to climb over. And it's a very simplistic idea that came from the 12th century or probably before, that you hear over and over again in modern politics. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't work. Now, the other one is incarceration. Basically grab all these people and put them in camps and don't let them go anywhere. You're talking about millions and millions of people, and it's not going to work. So once again, a pragmatic approach, which is accepting that this flow exists whether you try to stop it or not, like water. How you integrate those people, for better or worse, into your society and deal with them.
So as you know, Europe is facing a huge refugee crisis, well beyond what we're seeing in the US. And these migrant populations are being blamed for a lot of Europe's crime problems and terrorist activities. What are you seeing in working with these communities? Is that true? What are you seeing as far as their integration?
We're talking about in the hundreds of thousands, people coming across, let's say, the Mediterranean or going into Europe. And my experience has basically been in the prisons in Libya and with the smugglers, and also with the NGOs that are at sea rescuing these people, and then on land in Europe talking to these people. So I've had a very diverse exposure to migrants and immigrants, et cetera, et cetera. And the one commonality you hear is that they are leaving something that they don't feel is sustainable, and they're moving to something else that they think is better. Both parts of that equation are kind of fuzzy. In other words, they don't quite know what they're going to do when they get to Europe or America, and they don't quite know how to fix from where they came back. But what they do is they expose themselves to a human trafficking network, which they voluntarily pay money to. They know the horrors. They've got the internet. They've seen the documentaries and the news reports. And they go into this stream, which takes them across the desert, takes them into camps where they're abused and fleeced out of their money. It takes them to Libya, where they're hunted down and kidnapped. And after the last dollar has been squeezed out of them and their families, they get on these boats. And then when they get on these boats, they know they're not going to make it all the way to Europe. So they hope that somebody sees them and then pulls them off the boats. And they hope they don't drown within minutes of heading out to sea. And then when they get on land, they communicate with their diaspora, and they find a house, a place to stay. So the stories I've heard are both horrific and uplifting. So typical stories of people being, brutalized and raped and murdered in jail, and then people getting to Europe and being extremely depressed that they're no longer valued as a human being because they're a migrant. They're someone that is unwanted, almost like an infestation, that people don't want. And they realize that they had a certain sense of status in society back home. They had brothers and sisters and people knew who they were, and they strip that away when they come to Europe. So I'm actually working on a film right now that I'm directing, which is a 90-minute film about what it's like to go from your home to Europe, and what it's like to take these sea voyages and be put in jail. And I've interviewed lots of smugglers who tell very kind of simple but brutal stories about how they deal with these people. I talk to the migrants who sometimes are terribly depressed when they get to Europe. And part of that is almost like PTSD. Can you imagine being a doctor in Syria and having a practice and a beautiful home, and suddenly a barrel bomb comes out of nowhere and bang, you're homeless. And when you try to apply to Europe, well, why wouldn't you accept a Syrian family who's educated and affluent? And suddenly he realizes that he's nobody. So they end up having to pay smugglers to get them to Europe and rebuild their lives. Now, they don't want to live in Europe forever. They want to go back to Syria, but they can't go to Syria. So you have a lot of these very sad stories where public opinion has turned against them because of the numbers, not because of the individuals. And at the same time, I've met a lot of really stupid people that came from small towns in Africa that just decided, hey, I'm going to go to Europe, and get a job and become a soccer player and eat pizza. And you bet the mind boggles, but then you think there's nothing for them in Gambia or southern Nigeria, and everybody's going to Europe anyways. Sometimes it's cheaper to take a smuggling trip to Europe than it is to fly to Europe. So, I mean, there is a huge river of people. Each one has their own stories.
Yeah, historically, it's not always been Muslims. It was the Japanese, it was McCarthyism. It seems that somebody's always being singled out. If it weren't the Muslims, maybe it'd be another group, right? What do you think?
Keep in mind that this is fairly typical. You remember when Jewish refugees tried to come here in World War II, we didn't want them. There were actually a number of Jewish children on boats that were refused entry into ports. And we've had the same problem over, and it was the Irish, it was you name it, whatever the next wave is considered to be below standards and not wanted and whatever, and then suddenly they slowly become integrated. So this is what you're seeing in Europe, where people are being faced with thousands and thousands of people who they sort of have a blanket judgment on. Each one of these groups has their negative and positive. So you've got the, you remember you had the Italian mafia, the Jewish mafia, the Irish mafia, you have the Mexican mafia, and then you also have the brilliant scientists, so we can't judge them as one homogeneous pile of people. We have to say that there are good and bad in each one of these groups. So.
Wow, so it's pretty clear that the vast, vast majority of migrants are simply escaping an unlivable situation and trying to protect their families and looking for a better life, the American dream, right? However, how would you mitigate the risk posed by the few who would be considered legitimate security threats? What can be done to prevent that?
Well, the first step is to understand who's who. So don't lump them all into one big basket and call them migrants. Look at people's reasons, motivations, educational background. I know from the most basic human emotions that people are different. So a boatload of Nigerians is going to react differently than a boatload of Eritreans. But even within each one of those boats, everybody has a different story. So the numbers tend to overwhelm us, and we go, wow, there's 400 Eritreans, there's 3,000 Nigerians, there's 600 Syrians, there's 500 Bangladeshis, and we don't let them create their own little societal structures and say, okay, who amongst you is going to take charge, who can handle this, who in your group are you suspicious of, things like that. We tend to just lump them all as migrants. And I guess we legally have to. We deal with them as human beings, so we can't really sort of separate them or socialize them. In Libya, for example, they separate people by their national origins because they say the Nigerians are very violent and they cause riots and they always fight, and the Eritreans are very nice and they're calm. I mean, it's a bizarre world to go there. But what I'm saying is that when they come to Europe and America, we tend to just make them all the same, which means we tend to suspect them all. In other words, we ask questions like, well, are there terrorists coming to Europe? And it's like, yeah, of course there are, but, well, where are they? And it's like, well, all you have to do is ask. I mean, the people on the boat know if somebody's suspicious or he came from a certain place. And my point is we have all the tools we need, we just don't apply them. Because on one side, we're like, oh, we can't judge these people. They're coming in as refugees. We can't really separate them out and ask what their motivations are. On the other hand, we know that within any large number of people, there are going to be people who tend to either criminality, violence, or something else. So common sense actually should dictate what we do. We don't have time to sit there and talk to a million migrants about what they think. I mean, what you do is you empower the migrants to build their own social structures. So here's a case in point. When 100,000 Muslims come to a certain area, you build mosques for them. You build madrasas. You build things that allow them to create social centers, and then you promote people who are calm, respected elders to figure out who's who and what's what, and you let that society repress the violent actors or police themselves. What we tend to do is not want to engage them at that level. So guess what terrorist groups do, guess what extremists do? They create those social centers, whether it's online or whether it's physical meetings, and they energize them to be angry against whatever they're angry against. And then this is the problem, is that we don't engage. And this is one of the topics that is brought up over and over again, is, are terrorists coming to Europe? And I keep saying, well, I've been on this boat, I rescued these people, I didn't see any tourists, but I can tell you this much, the terrorists are already in Europe. In other words, there's more members of ISIS inside Europe than there are in some other countries. And these people are recruited, they're motivated, they're turned into terrorists. It doesn't matter their place of origin. And actually, one of the least likely areas to find a terrorist is in the flow of migrants. But it's also one of the more sensitive areas once they get to a region and they're sort of demonized or ignored or impoverished, that these people very much can turn towards a violent solution if they're not engaged intelligently. And this is the key to understanding terrorism and migration, that most of the terrorists initially came from refugee camps. In other words, in Afghanistan, when we started pumping billions of dollars into fighting the Soviets, we recruited people out of the refugee camps in Pakistan to go back in and fight inside Afghanistan. So places like Myanmar, where you have the Rohingyas, who are not terrorists, who are not aligned. They're Muslims, but they're not aligned with any sort of terrorist groups or violent groups, are literally being beaten, burned, attacked, raped. Now these people, at some point, are going to fight back, and if we're not offering them an option, then sometimes terrorist groups will. So before 9/11, a friend of mine who was trained in the camps by bin Laden was working with the FBI to point out criminal elements and fingered Hani Hanjour to the Arizona FBI. Now, Hani Hanjour was one of the hijackers. Almost the entire number of hijackers were actually identified by either flight schools, by various law enforcement and communities as being odd, like up to something. But we didn't act because we thought a terrorist was a white ex-military person because of Oklahoma. Because of the Oklahoma bombings, we thought they were all militia members. So we weren't focused on Islamic terrorists. Now we obsess with Islamic terrorists. And once again, these communities have a way of policing themselves. They can tell you if somebody doesn't fit in, if somebody went to Pakistan for training, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just saying that we have to put some of this burden on the communities of immigrants, and we have to listen to them when they say, this guy's not a terrorist, he's just angry and he's, whatever. So fine, let him go. But we are developing a level of intolerance and fear caused by insider attacks, which are exactly created to create that fear and that distrust amongst migrant communities.
Robert, what are some of the causes of radicalization, or terrorism for that matter? Even looking at the non-Islamic attacks, such as Columbine, do you see a common thread, such as isolation of the perpetrators or any other kind of social patterns?
For many, many years, I've told people that Al-Qaeda and ISIS and groups like that are essentially cults. They use some of the basics of seeking people who are not identifying with society, seeking people who are angry about something, alienating them, in other words, isolating them away from the mainstream, their family, and then teaching them basically the reverse Maslow hierarchy of needs. In other words, you want to die, you don't want to build a community, you don't want to be safe, and then unleashing those people back on normal society. And when you put people, for example, in refugee camps, or prisons, or places where they're closely connected and they're all angry and they're not part of society, it is absolutely normal for antisocial behavior to be taught and absorbed and passed along. And I'm not saying that America does that, but you can imagine Gitmo, for example, where you had a number of people who were there for a variety of reasons, none of them charged with a crime, but all forming an association, almost like an alumni, that then go back and share whatever they feel with other angry people in their communities. And these are all perfect examples of not integrating people into society, or at least not attempting to. And if they are criminals, not quickly returning them back to where they came from or dealing with them as criminals, but allowing them to live within a diaspora or a group.
Okay, so I'm understanding that it's not only important for these migrants to integrate into the cultures of where they're landing, but also into their own cultures so that they can be seen and respected and live healthy lives and get jobs and have a community. Are there any solutions or ways that that can be done more effectively that you can recommend?
First step is to look at the major reasons why these people are fleeing, right? We have wars in Afghanistan and in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, I mean, you name it, Somalia, that have gone on for years and years and years that have never been resolved. They've always been left at a certain state of instability. So as long as we tolerate that worldwide, people aren't going to be going back home to rebuild. So those solutions can range from extreme violence, as you saw with the Russians and Assad in Syria, to more peaceful versions like you see in Somalia and Afghanistan, where they're trying to integrate they weren't terrorist groups, but they're trying to integrate people like the Taliban to come in towards the government, which at first sounds a little scary, but then you realize as soon as you have to fix a pothole and you have to get elected democratically, that tends to get rid of a lot of these insurgent and extremist groups, because they have to integrate into society. The second thing is we have to make it very clear to the EU and the US governments that they have to deal with this migration. They can't pretend it's not happening. They can't hope that it goes away. I mean, there will always be hundreds of thousands of people trying to come to America, trying to come to Europe. So the faster we create programs to integrate them, whether it's guest worker programs or things that get them, working and on their own feet, the faster we can judge them as whether they are integrating quickly or slowly, but at least we have to give them a chance. And the third thing is that we have to be able to judge people we don't want in the country. So if we feel that there are a plethora of economic migrants who are just choking up the system, then we also have to be a little rude and brutal and say, okay, I'm sorry. Yes, you jumped across the fence, but we're going to have to put you back to the country where you came from. And that tends to discourage a lot of economic migrants. Now, strangely enough, I'm a migrant. I came from Canada. I migrated to the US. And I look around me in California and I see thousands of undocumented people working here. It doesn't bother me that much if they're integrated into society, but we don't allow them to integrate into society because we have these sort of very hard rules that, okay, you broke the law, so you have to go back to Mexico or El Salvador or whatever. But yet they're already here and they're working and they're sending their money back to their families, et cetera, et cetera. So I would advocate a more liberalized approach to people who have shown that they can integrate, and then a tougher approach to people who shows that they can integrate. And these would be criminals that you see being sent over and people that are abusing the border system. So I think there's a lot of solutions if we just accept the fact that this is going to be part of our future for the next 10, 20, 30 years. There's an open border movement that says that these colonial era borders and these old city-state borders are obsolete. And you see a movement in Europe to create a larger economic zone. I mean, you've seen how America has flourished because we don't have to go through checkpoints through every state. Should there be a border between Canada and the US? Probably not. So there are people that are pushing for open borders, and at the same time, there are people who are pushing for tighter controls because they're fearful of other people.
Right.
And I'm not a politician, so I don't care. But the point is that the more we look at actual migrants and more we analyze how they contribute financially and economically, and the more we put them on the tax-paying rolls and the more we integrate them into society, the quicker we're going to be a smart country as opposed to sort of an 18th century country. So that's what I see happening is we live in a global environment. Yeah, we communicate globally. We should think globally.
Robert, this is such valuable information, and I have so many takeaways already. And to add to that, one of the most important things we're doing with this broadcast is giving people a call to action. What is something that people watching back at home can do to address these issues?
Well, I'm not a social activist, but I'll say this is that we are trending towards very simplistic problems and solutions to very complex problems, and they don't always work out that way. So what I would suggest people do is talk to somebody who came from somewhere else and listen to their story, and it's probably not that much different from the next guy that's going to come from somewhere else. We all eventually settle down and get on with our lives, and migration is the biggest single problem on earth right now. It's not hunger, it's not war, it's the fact that we're displacing mass amounts of people, which forces everybody everywhere to deal with how we solve this problem. So I don't have any call to action other than talk to a migrant, figure out what his problems are, be a little smarter when people have discussions, and when somebody says, let's build a wall, just say, hey, have you ever seen these tunnels that go under the Mexican border? And start knocking down some of that sort of simplistic jingoism. And by the way, a lot of these people are happy to go home. It's not like we're tied to the ground. We all move everywhere all the time. So it's not like people have to sit in one spot once they behave themselves. They should be able to go back to where they came from and visit their family. So Anyways, it's get deeper into the problem and see some of the solutions that are out there.
Thank you so much, Robert, for joining us. Your human perspective is vital for everyone to understand, and this has been incredibly human.
Thank you very much.
And everyone back home, if you want to learn more about Robert, check out his autobiography, The Adventurist. You can find a link to that in his website, Come Back Alive, on empowermentworks.org/POM, along with all kinds of calls to action and links to the latest petitions and things that you can do. And don't miss another episode. You can see what's happening next there. And be sure to subscribe to Empowerment Works TV right here. We also have a dialogue going on this video, so please chime in, let us know what you're thinking, what is going on in your world, tell us your stories. Your voice matters. Be part of the movement. We'll see you next time. Thank you.